This afternoon, we're going to talk about voting rights and expanding voting rights to the justice-involved population. I am Nicole Porter. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, and earlier this month, we released a report, Locked Out 2020, Estimates of People Denied Voting Rights Due to a Felony Conviction. This afternoon's conversation builds on that report and other reports and discussions and work that the Sentencing Project, along with our participants, our panelists this afternoon, and many of the folks in the audience who are doing this work day to day, right in the midst of the 2020 election season. So excited to have this discussion, and thank you all for joining us. So despite the victories of folks in Florida and even in the voting rights expansion that we're going to hear about this afternoon, the recent report I just mentioned estimates that well over 5 million residents around the country are excluded from the franchise because of a felony conviction. And while that is a decline since the last report that came out 4 years ago, the decline is too modest, only about 15%. So the report we're going to hear about and the activism that we're also going to hear about highlights a key problem of the criminal legal system mediating democracy. It's extremely problematic that in the United States, a group of citizens is disproportionately subjected to the coercive power of the criminal legal system through the police, prosecution, courts, and prisons, and subsequently stripped of their voting rights. Racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal legal system are linked to disparities in political representation. Black residents are disproportionately excluded from voting because of felony convictions. The report estimates that 1 in 16 African Americans of voting age cannot vote because of a felony conviction, a rate almost 4 times greater than that for non-Black residents. And 34 states disenfranchise Latinx residents more than the general population. So there are many efforts to expand voting rights. People around the country may have heard a lot this voting season about Florida and the efforts to expand rights and the legislature's effort to work around the people's will and limit rights for justice-involved citizens. But there's other reforms going on as well. Active campaigns happening this season. We're going to hear from Daisy out in California later, who's going to talk to us about a ballot measure in that state to expand voting rights to people in the community. And we're going to hear from other efforts, people who have their rights restored in Nebraska and Tennessee. We're going to hear from them this afternoon. We're also going to hear about a new trend around expanding voting rights to people in prison with the felony conviction. Many know that Vermont and Maine are 2 states that allow that. Puerto Rico is a territory that expanded the right to folks in prison in the 1980s. And earlier this year, the District of Columbia expanded voting rights to people in prison. And we're going to hear from the bill sponsor around that this afternoon. So let's get started. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on with the discussion. As we move on, I want to encourage folks in the audience to ask questions because we'll get to them before we wrap up, and you can post your questions in the Q&A. But let me quickly introduce our panelists. So we're going to hear from Shakur Abdullah, who survived 41 years in prison and founded Just Us Vote in Nebraska while disenfranchised following his imprisonment. Shakur is an Omaha, Nebraska native and a based restorative justice trainer and outreach specialist with the Community Justice Center. The CJC is a restorative justice public safety agency headquartered in Lincoln, and his vast experience from his directly lived experience behind prison walls, as well as providing pre and post-release reentry services, helps animate his advocacy in Nebraska. We're also going to hear from Daisy Chavez, a statewide advocacy manager with California's Initiate Justice. She is a graduate of their Institute of Impacted Leaders program, which is a 12-week course designed to teach organizing and advocacy skills to people who have been impacted by mass incarceration. Daisy has loved ones who've been impacted by the carceral system and advocates for abolition, having experienced the harmful effects of mass incarceration through her loved ones. We're also going to hear from Dawn Harrington, who's a formerly incarcerated activist based in Nashville, Tennessee, who just got her voting rights back and voted earlier this year. Don is Executive Director of Free Hearts Tennessee and Systems Manager for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. In 2014, Don started working with Ban the Box Nashville, a policy that took effect in January 1st. Many know that Ban the Box is when questions around criminal conviction history or prior justice involvement are delayed on employment and in some states on housing applications as well. Then we're also going to hear from Chris Eugen, who's actually going to start us off. He's the lead author on the report I mentioned earlier, the Locked Out Report. Professor Eugen is a Regents Professor and Distinguished Midnight Professor of Sociology and Law at the University of Minnesota and a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology. He studies crime, law, and justice with the firm belief that sound research can help build a more just and peaceful world. With Jeff Manza, he wrote the book, Locked Out, Felon Disenfranchisement in American Democracy, and the report that the Sentencing Project published with his research and his research partners' efforts. It's called Locked Out 2020 and updates that analysis. We're also going to hear from Councilmember Robert Wright, who's a Washington, D.C. City Council member. He's the sponsor of D.C.'s Restore the Vote Amendment, which I mentioned earlier, and that bill expands voting rights to persons in prison with felony convictions, including the district amongst 4 jurisdictions, 2 states, Maine and Vermont, as well as Puerto Rico, that allow people to vote from prison with felony convictions. Mr. White is an at-large member of the Council of the District of Columbia and chair of the Committee on Facilities and Procurement. So with that, we're going to allow all of our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes. Then we'll show a video and then we'll go into Q&A. So please, audience members, welcome again. And I want to encourage you all to post any questions and comments in the Q&A. But Chris, we'll go to you first.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's a real honor to be with this distinguished panel here. And thank you all for your interest in this work. For about 20 years, I've been studying the issue of disenfranchisement of people with a felony level criminal convictions. And this is a real pivotal year for writing the report. We've finally started to reduce the numbers, far too little, but we've moved from about 6.1 million to well over 5 million, I think 5.17. Half the states have changed their laws. There's been a lot of action. But in saying that, I can't be too optimistic because we still have so many people disenfranchised in a way, and we can't normalize disenfranchisement. We can't treat that as the status quo or the furniture in the room. We really have to keep pushing. And I would say that, you know, all of the recent action around the states and in DC and really globally, it shows that this disenfranchisement, the door is kind of hanging on its hinges, just barely. And I think it can be pushed through. So we've made a tremendous difference, but we know that there's still states that have long-term restrictions post-sentence. We have disenfranchisement rates still. Alabama over 9%. Florida, despite all of the promise of Amendment 4, still sanctioning folks or not allowing them to vote because of outstanding monetary sanctions. We're making an update to this report, in fact, to add some more detail on fines and fees as a barrier to voting. In part with the help of Margie Love, who's written quite a bit on this. Nicole mentioned the racial disparities. Again, many of these laws emerged from the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, and they persist. Where other restrictions on the franchise had fallen in the Civil Rights era, felon disenfranchisement, as it has been called, persists. And the key thing to me is also that, you know, most of the people aren't incarcerated that we're talking about. Most of the people who are affected are in our communities, and this practice is almost uniquely American. There's no other place around the world, unless you've been, say, convicted of bribing public officials or election crimes. No other nation disenfranchises people, imposes this lifetime stigma. So I will cede my time now to hear the other panelists, because I know we have some great expertise on the panel today.
I love it. Thank you, Chris. And we're going to get back to you because I'm sure there are plenty of questions from the audience about the research in the report that we can share later this afternoon. But Shakur, let's go to you. Want to invite you to provide comments of your work in Nebraska and your experience around getting your voting rights back as well. You're muted, Shakur.
There we go. Thanks, Nicole, for having me on such a distinguished panel as this. You know, I really realized that my disenfranchisement after voting really wasn't my first encounter with being disenfranchised. It really started with my father, who was a Korean War vet who came back to America attempting to try to vote in Mississippi and was denied. I used to hear stories that he told of just the whole Jim Crow era and being denied voting. So when I went to prison, Nebraska had a lifetime ban on returning citizens being able to vote. In 2005, that law got changed. Now there is a 2-year waiting period to vote. As I sat in prison in 2005, there was a lot of jubilation around the fact that the law had been changed, but I sat there thinking that that wasn't good enough, that even in prison, we remain citizens, which to me is the most important part of this discussion. Your citizenship as a direct result of your felony conviction is not abrogated. You remain a citizen. So when I got my chance to get released, that was one of the things that I thought about, you know, is my ability to be able to vote. I had remembered all of these stories that my father had told me about, and much of the just 60 era that I witnessed in terms of people being denied the right to vote. So in 2 years after I was released in 2016, I was able to vote for the first time in my life. It really proved to be a much more emotional experience than I had actually prepared for. I thought, well, I would just be able to, you know, do what everybody else had did, vote, and that was the end of it. But it really triggered memories and in me that I really didn't expect. You know, I had realized that I had just performed an act that many people that looked like me once would get killed for, maybe beat, or have to pay some poll tax to engage in. So for me, it was really a moving experience. I actually started Justice 15 Vote, which is a mashup between the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution and a old Richard Pryor joke. But I started that grassroots organization as a way to engage the returning citizen population, because it is a population after securing housing and employment. Voting begins to be probably the next most important thing that reconnects you back into the community in a way that nothing else does. So I was always puzzled why I remained a citizen. Yes, I had a felony conviction. However, I couldn't vote for 2 years, but didn't stop me from having to pay taxes. That was something that I had to immediately do. So my analogy is, if my tax money is good enough to take, my vote should be too. So I am currently working with a senator here in Nebraska, Senator Justin Wayne, who has introduced legislation for the last 3 sessions trying to do away with the 2-year waiting period. It got held up in committee again this year, but he has vowed, as long as he is there in the legislature, he will continue to introduce legislation to do away with even the 2-year waiting period. With that, I will yield my time. Thank you. Nicole, back to you.
Thank you so much, Shakur. And so helpful to hear about active efforts in the Midwest to expand the voting rights this year, and the commitment of yourself and the senator you're working with, the state senator you're working with, to continue those efforts going forward. So now we're going to go to Tennessee, going to go down south and hear from Don with Free Hearts Tennessee, who also works with the National Council. So Don, want to invite you to share your experiences around expanding voting rights, including your own effort and your own experience around voting this election season.
Thank you. So first of all, just wanted to say that there is a long history of voter suppression, in this country, in the South, in Tennessee. In Tennessee, the last known person lynched was trying to register to vote and start an NAACP chapter. And that was in 1940. And so we have a long history to reckon with. In my situation, I was incarcerated in New York, and I never lived in New York. And, New York had automatic voting rights restoration, but I go back home and I lost my voting rights. And we have a process where we have to petition to get our voting rights through a certificate of restoration and get the arresting authority to fill out the paperwork. And so New York, they didn't have any, they didn't have any knowledge of this process, and me bringing this paper around to try to get people to fill it out. And, I ended up having to go through this whole process and go back to court, and ended up with a certificate that works for the state of New York as far as employability, and still no one would fill out my paperwork at first. And so, it took us starting the campaign around, voting rights and connecting with Campaign Legal Center, and to help navigate the process, because we have such a convoluted process, period. In Tennessee, over 456,000 people have been disenfranchised. We're the only state that requires a person to be up to date on child support to get their voting rights back. And, many people are held back due to court costs and restitution, and from restoring the franchise. But what we've been seeing from trying to help people is that some counties are telling people that all fees have to be paid, misdemeanor charges have to be paid. It's just no uniformity in the process. There's no timeline. It's just horrible. And I always like to note that between January of 1973 and May of 1981, there was no disenfranchisement in the state of Tennessee. So as Free Hearts, that is the vision that we're working towards. So as Nicole mentioned, Maine and Vermont, where people never lose their right to vote. And so what we've been doing, we've been helping over 1,000 people try to restore their voting rights. And we know it's gonna have to continue past this election, because even with us navigating the process, there's people, they've lost their, the cores that came from the criminal court clerk. We're still doing things, even though it's way past the election, for this election, because of the process and them losing things and not sending things over and not, want to get things done. So we have a lot of work to do. We also started a fines and fees fund to pay the court costs and restitution that are holding people back. And so we were able to pay some of the fees, and shout out to our partners, Kenny Stills, the Casey Fund, Jarrell Casey, and Ryan Casey, and the Players Coalition, and a few others that have really helped us to be able to pay some of these fees. But it's so many fees. Just in the city that I'm in Nashville, we have over 65,000 people that owe $5,000 or less. And so that's just from the last 20 years. And so before then, it's way more. And then what we've been seeing is amounts that are way higher. And then when it comes to these restitutions, some of them are like hundreds of thousands of dollars. People will never be able to pay this. And so, we have a long way to go, and we're working towards bold policy change, automatic voting rights restoration on the way to no one having their voting rights ever, taken away. And so I was able to vote, as Nicole mentioned, in this election. It was such a beautiful moment. I eased on down the road on in there, did my dance, cried, all of the things. But, the happiness is short-lived because we have so much work to do. And I know when we overcome all of this voter suppression, we're going to be a powerful voting bloc. So super motivated, very happy to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. So appreciate the work you're doing, obviously, and the impact it's had on your own life and your own experience as a voter this election season. And your next steps in expanding the franchise in Tennessee is a great starting place, or a great next part of this discussion, because we're going to hear now from Councilmember White in the district, who will talk about his efforts to expand voting rights to people in prison. So it's so great to hear that you all at Free Hearts are thinking about that in the South. And, we hope that the lessons in the district can offer a tale around that. So Councilmember White, let me kick it over to you.
Nicole, thanks so much for having me, and I'm excited to be here with these other panelists who I'm very inspired by so far. So we passed this year, just this summer, a bill called Restore the Vote, which, as Nicole said, restores voting rights to our residents incarcerated with felony convictions. Luckily for me, the council years ago expanded voting rights to people who were incarcerated with misdemeanors and folks who have been released from incarceration or were incarcerated awaiting trial. So this was our last step here in the district. It was a big step that honestly I thought would take a lot longer. But because of the work of returning citizens, because of the work of organizations like the Sentencing Project and Nicole personally, we were able to get this done in about a year, which was amazing to see. But the reason that returning citizens in DC brought this idea to me to introduce is because of the work I've done on incarceration and for returning citizens, just because of the issues that my own family has had over the years. And when I dug into the history that Chris really went into, the way that state after state after state, really as a deliberate way of suppressing Black votes, took away the right to vote from incarcerated people. This isn't something that came with or from the founding fathers. This was something that was done deliberately to suppress the Black vote, and unfortunately has worked tremendously and has become, I really like the expression Chris used, a part of the furniture. Like you see it and so you expect it and you navigate around it. But that's not right. Shakur said it best. You don't lose your citizenship when you become incarcerated. So why would you lose your most basic right of citizenship, your vote, the only real tool you have to keep elected officials accountable? So we passed this bill. We were very excited to be able to get this implemented into law ahead of the 2020 elections. I'm already hearing from folks through their family members, incarcerated people who are voting for the first time, hearing stories like Shakur's, like Dawn's, of people, really feeling like their humanity is recognized, their dignity is recognized, and it's a powerful, powerful thing. But and so since Chris can get into the history of this better than any of us here, one point I want to touch on, well, 2 points I want to touch on is one, why this is so important. And Dawn, I think, set this up really well. Incarcerated people will, if they get the right to vote, become a voting bloc. And that is important when we think about what our prisons look like, what our system of incarceration looks like and is geared toward. Right. So elected officials are not going to continue to neglect the conditions of prison, or the lack of reentry services, or the overuse of things like solitary confinement, if they know they're going to be held accountable by people who are incarcerated. But if folks who are incarcerated cannot hold elected officials accountable, we won't see change. And on the back end, that's going to mean people who are less successful after incarceration. It's going to mean people who are less healthy during incarceration. And that's not good for any of us. And so we have to move things in a different direction. But I think DC's bill also highlights the possibility, right? So no state now can say we can't undo what has been done in the past because DC did it, and did it under the leadership of formerly incarcerated people. So I encourage everybody who's tuned into this to really dig into why this is important, not accept for 1 second that this is the way things have to be, and really shoot for the stars on this. We can't stop this fight until every person who is incarcerated has the right to vote that they should not have lost to begin with. Unfortunately, we're fighting incrementally for I mean, folks who aren't even incarcerated anymore. It's ridiculous that we have to fight for that. But keep fighting for that. Keep fighting to push further, because I do think we're in a moment where we can gain real momentum if we really start to pull together, which is why I'm really grateful and excited about the work that Nicole and the Sentencing Project are doing, because we need somebody who's going to pull us together across the country so we can really work in a unified way.
Thank you so much, Councilmember White. And I know you might have to leave us early, but I do want everyone on the call, on the webinar, to recognize that the district is resetting new progressive norms in the country by passing the Restore the Vote law that Councilmember White sponsored. So from a progressive district, I only hope that there will be automatic rights restoration for everyone in the community, but that there will be universal suffrage for everyone in the United States, including those in prison who've been disappeared behind prison walls. So Councilmember White, please stay on to the extent that you can, but we also understand if you have to leave early. And we want to encourage folks to be in touch with you, particularly if they're looking for ways to expand voting rights to people in prison in their state. But we also want to give Daisy Chavez out in California an opportunity to share some comments. California has a major voting rights reform on the ballot that will hopefully get decided next week in favor of expanding voting rights to tens of thousands of residents in California. So Daisy, please share with us the work that you're doing out in California and the effort to expand the vote there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole, and just echoing what the panelists have said, that it really is an honor to be here to talk about the work that we are doing here in California. So in California, we have a proposition that's on the ballot for this upcoming election that will be decided next week, called Proposition 17. And so what Proposition 17 would do is it would restore the right to vote to over 50,000 Californians who have completed their prison term immediately upon their release from prison. So currently in California, the populations that cannot register to vote are folks who are currently in prison and those who are on parole. And so we actually at Initiate Justice had this idea a couple of years ago brought to us by one of our incarcerated inside organizers, Rasan Thomas. And so what we had done back in 2017 was we had reached out to our incarcerated members to ask them what policy reforms they wanted us to pursue. And so Rasan Thomas, who sits on our board of directors and is incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, informed us that he believed that we should pursue policy that would restore voting rights for everybody in California, including those who were in prison, and under the belief that, you know, everybody should have a voice in the policies that influence their community. And this really echoes what folks have shared on this panel. Shakur mentioned this as well, that, you know, even when you are incarcerated, you are still part of a community, especially those who, you know, who are closest in this case to the policies that are impacting folks in the state prison system or in the county jails. There's often policies that are passed that affect them, their sentence and the communities that they live in. And so, you know, they should absolutely have a say in what happens in our democracy. And so what we did was, based off this idea, we began collecting signatures in 2018 to place an initiative on the ballot called the Voting Restoration and Democracy Act of 2018. And so that would have restored voting rights for everybody in California, including those who were in state prison. Unfortunately, we were not able to secure the necessary number of signatures needed in order to place it on the ballot. And so what we did instead was we ended up conducting a survey with over 1,000 incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals to ask them what their thoughts were on, on their political priorities, and also to gain a better understanding of how our political system in California would change if people in prison and on parole had that right to vote. And so with those results, we ended up publishing the Democracy Needs Everyone report, which was launched last year in 2019, at the same time that we introduced the legislative bill that gave birth to Proposition 17. And so in this case, we were only seeking restoration for voting rights for people who have completed their prison term based on the results that we had from the survey. But we also found from the survey that folks who were incarcerated also want to participate in our democracy. Over 90% of the respondents said that they were mostly concerned about public safety, and they wanted to have a say in how to reduce crime, fund support for victims and survivors of crime, and also a variety of other policy proposals. And so we really are hoping that with Proposition 17, it opens the door to re-enfranchising so many folks who have not had a say and had been excluded from our democratic process, and to really start paving the way and chipping away at disenfranchisement that still exists, like you said, with only 2 states that allow people who are in prison to vote. We want to definitely come back and free the vote for those who are in our state prisons. But this is a proposition that we are working on, very excited about, and to join the national momentum of so many states who have already made changes. So, this is just something that we are having a lot of good polling results for. 71% of people who have already voted have said that they voted yes for this proposition. So we are really excited just to see, what the results will be like on election night. And just happy to be part of this conversation. And I'll turn it back over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Daisy. Just so helpful to have a report out from California, to hear how things are going, and then to also hear about your long-term strategy. So you're starting with the ballot measure this year that is polling incredibly well. If I heard you right, that's over 70% of polled likely voters support expanding voting rights to people in the community. Absolutely phenomenal. And we know that you can take that and build on that to expand voting rights to people in prison. So encouraged by that. So let's show the video. It'll actually feature some people you all have already seen this afternoon. And then on the other side of the video, we will have Q&A and get to some of these questions that some of our enthusiastic audience members have been posing along the way. So Morgan, can I turn it over to you?
I encourage everyone to turn up the volume on their computer.
I think in my lifetime, this is the most important election I know of. And it really, really upsets me that I'm probably not going to get to vote in. That just really hurts to the core.
I'm much more than my crime. I did that and I paid my dues. Why can I not vote?
Black people have been beaten and been killed for this right to vote. As being African American myself also, I hold that right sacred, and I would love to be able to exercise it.
When I got out of prison, I was unable to do many things. And then I learned not only could I not vote when I got out of prison, but then I couldn't vote the whole 10 years of my probation either.
I myself could not vote until just this year. It took me almost a decade.
I'm formerly incarcerated. I was able to regain my rights to vote in Missouri. When I moved to Kentucky, I again lost those rights. For reasons that really don't make sense, I can't vote again.
I have friends who said, why is it affecting you so much that you can't vote? And that would always shock me. I'd be like, because that's one of my basic rights as an American citizen, is to vote and to be heard and to have my voice count. Not being able to do that for 24 years really weighed heavily on me.
All these things happening in our community and not being able to have a say is not a good feeling at all. I really felt like really less than a man.
We've ran into so many people that, have given up, just like how I had given up.
So I cast my vote for the first time in 24 years during this year's primaries. I went to the voting machine, I cast my votes. I mean, the tears were just coming down my face. My husband had tears in his eyes too. And the people were just so happy, they were cheering. I mean, they made this big deal of it, and I can't tell you how wonderful it was to get people who got why I was so excited about it.
To be here in 2020 and be able to cast my vote on a year like this, it was pretty amazing. As I was walking in the building, I actually danced like the Wiz, ease on down the road, all the way in the door.
How I'm feeling election night. You know, just a great feeling that still being like a citizen of our community in our city of Washington, D.C., and to know that I have a say, man, that's just going to be such an amazing feeling. Something, like I said, that I never expected to see or experience while being incarcerated. I have two beautiful young granddaughters that are growing up in this world, and I want only the best for them.
I feel like finally my voice is being heard again. Finally, I matter. Finally, I'm a member of society 100% again.
Our vote does matter. Our vote is important, and it's a part of our collective power.
My final wish for 2020 would be that everyone who can vote does vote. I hope people vote for those of us that can't.
Every time I watch that video, it makes me even more emotional. And then I just saw one of the audience members saying, you know, why am I crying right now? And I gotta tell you, every time I watch it, I even have a stronger reaction to it. So just want to thank Morgan and her work for that, as well as our colleague, Brianna Bishop, who did a lot of work in helping to produce and craft that video. And thank you, Dawn, for joining us and participating in it. So now let's go to questions, and we'll take some of the questions from the audience. We'll try to get to all of them, and I've left enough time for dialogue with all of the panelists this afternoon. But one question that I wanted to start us off with was, what would you tell people about felony disenfranchisement or efforts to expand the vote that hasn't been mentioned already? Chris, if you're trying to talk, you're muted.
I'm worried about the chilling effects that prosecutions for illegal voting have. And I think that this is part of a suppression effort, that even where people have the legal right, they're being intimidated against voting, and that indeed we have this insane prospect of people being prosecuted for illegal voting and doing time. And so we have to restore the vote to get out of that. But I think Desmond Meade said, we don't scare easy, and to remind folks that that indeed you have the right, we need to exercise it.
So does anyone else want to jump in there?
I could just jump in real quick. I think another form of voter suppression for people that are impacted by the justice system that doesn't get talked about as much as access to voting in jails. And like, for example, here in Tennessee, we've been working on making the jail a polling site. And we've actually tried to help people through the process. And since then, some laws have came back that have been repressive that prevents from helping in completely, and also criminalizes it. But, literally people that we've helped through the process, they still didn't get their absentee ballot. And that's in Nashville, which is one of our, most progressive counties. And, Davidson County, our progressive county. And so the other 94 counties, we know, and we're hearing from a lot of people that they're not being allowed to vote in the jail. And they haven't lost their voting rights at all. So I just wanted to name that.
Thank you for bringing that up, Dawn. And I want to invite people to seek out another Sentencing Project resource, Voting in Jails report that was published earlier this year. We're working to support active coalitions to ensure voter access to people in jail who experience de facto disenfranchisement. And I know some of our colleagues from the Marshall Project may be on the call this afternoon. They published a great overview earlier this week around voting in jails as well. So I think they might have posted the link in the chat. So I want to encourage people to seek that out and also to learn from what Dawn is doing in Tennessee and what some of the other activists are doing around the country as well. Any other comments around what we haven't heard already that you think people should know about felony disenfranchisement and efforts to expand the franchise? Looks like you, Shakur, want to get in.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that I think that there's just too much confusion around the issue of voting. It's like a patchwork quilt of this state does this state does that. It just makes it too confusing. I think that there has to be a national concerted effort to equalize everything. I mean, if you look at the smoking age, it was just raised to 21. So I don't see why there is any reason why there can't be a national effort to simplify this matter of voting so that there is no confusion. There's no confusion in Vermont, no confusion in Maine, no confusion in DC now. The basic requirement is citizenship and are you old enough? So I think that should be the effort that the future effort that is made, is just to make a national policy that applies to everybody.
Great, thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm just wanting to piggyback onto that because it is confusing. Like, you know, even in the comments, I'm looking at different people who are commenting about confusion in some of the other states. So the right to vote should not be something that is very difficult to decipher. It should be, you know, very crystallized, like black and white, like, okay, here's the requirements. This is who can vote. And there shouldn't be any exclusions on it as long as, you know, we have the age requirement and so forth. But, you know, to participate in our democracy, you know, and we're making it so hard, you know, especially in this time and age when there's so much happening that it's impacting so many people. We really should just make it more clear across the board, like, you know, what the requirements are, and really just bring in, especially the voices of those who have experienced felony disenfranchisement. I think it was really powerful having Shakur on the panel, just hearing from their direct experience, you know, because that's something that Initiate Justice that we've seen is the feedback from folks who have experienced that and what it's felt like to have their voice silenced and to be told that their experience doesn't matter. And that's not the case at all, because they are the people who have experienced, you know, the problems of the instances they have been involved in the environment, and they have policy solutions that could really help us create a better world where we can live in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daisy. So Morgan, let's bring in any questions or comments that you think might be helpful from the audience. Is there any questions that we can ask to our panelists?
Sure. This question was for Congressmember Robert White, but I'm wondering if anyone else wants to jump in. They wanted to ask, what's the opposition for reforming felony disenfranchisement laws? Does anybody want to comment about what's the pushback and what are the messages that have been successful to overcome this pushback?
I'll just say briefly that the one of the challenges is the partisan issue, and particularly if Republicans fear that they will lose some votes, and also Democrats are terrified of the crime issue or being perceived as soft on crime in any way, and that leads us to this political stalemate where it comes down to some kind of vote counting exercise instead of discussion about a fundamental right in a democracy.
Thank you. Anyone else have experiences to share with opposition?
I can share just some of the things that we've experienced on the campaign for Prop 17 and the journey that we experienced is one of the biggest opposition talking points was that people who were on parole were still serving a prison sentence, and that is actually not the case. There was a court ruling that indicated that a person's prison term is completed the day they walk out of prison. And so that's been often like the main talking point from the opposition, that that is the reason why people should not have the right to vote. But parole is intended to be a period of reintegration when folks are, out in the community, building those relationships, and really just kind of, getting their life back together and contributing to society. We've seen, like, at least on our campaign, we have impacted folks who serve as our spokespeople for the campaign, who talk about their experience and the contributions they've done to their community. And they're just, on our campaign, we have 5, but there are so many other people across California who we've seen at the legislature give testimony for hearings and just do advocacy and organizing, who have contributed in so many ways. And so folks who have, are on parole should not be silenced, because their experience brings so much value to the decisions that are being made in our democracy. So that's been the main talking point, is just pushing back on the fact that that parole is an extension of someone's prison term, but that is not the case at all.
And there are going to be so many active campaigns to expand voting rights to people on community supervision. So I know there's going to be active work in Georgia, Minnesota, as well as Tennessee, where our panelist Dawn is from. So the lessons learned this year in California will help to really animate some of the strategies in other parts of the country as well. Any other questions, Morgan?
Lots of questions. Is felony disenfranchisement something that could be remedied with one federal law, or does every state need to change their laws?
I can offer an ill-advised legal opinion on that because I'm not a lawyer, but I will say that right now Richardson versus Ramirez is a Supreme Court precedent from the 1970s that's been tough to overcome in the courts. It's granted states the capacity to do this. It's been chipped away at, and I think that we've seen action in the courts on this issue, and particularly around poll taxes and some of the fine and fee issues that we've talked about. So there's different theories being advanced, but I do think a federal law would help enormously, and it would likely be challenged, but I consider it, a multi-pronged strategy that the courts, the executive branch, the legislature, and grassroots organizing.
I too am not a lawyer, and will not offer any legal advice on this call. I will say that administrations matter, federal administrations matter, in an administration that is focused on expanding the vote for all citizens, including justice-involved ones, ensuring that information is provided, and using the authority of a federal agency like the Department of Justice to actually disseminate information and ensure that all jurisdictions, states, and localities have information and have a resource office to go to is critical. And so the leadership in DC does matter in that regard, in addition to a congressional strategy that can help to improve the law, even though it might not be able to influence law state by state, given principles of federalism throughout the country. Any other questions, Morgan?
Another technical question. Is there ever a process such as bankruptcy that could free people from their fines and fees? It seems as if in some cases the person would never be able to pay them their fines and fees back during their entire lifetime.
I can speak a little bit to this about what we're working on is now that we're past the registration deadline and working more towards the long term. And it's a long strategy, but I mean, it's a long process, but we're filing fee waivers for those fees. And that's one way here in Tennessee that you can do with the fees, but you can't do that for restitution. But as far as the fees, that's one way.
The next question is asking the panelists to comment on states like Kentucky that had a governor sign an executive order reenfranchising some people. Is this a good strategy? What are your thoughts on gubernatorial executive orders?
I'd say that's where a lot of the action has been between 2016 and 2020. So some of the changes have come about through that process. In New York, Governor Cuomo reenfranchised those on parole, and Iowa, we saw an executive order. But I would say it doesn't have the permanency that a legislative change does, or a major change to constitutional law, so that we view it as a temporary fix, a temporary relief. And just know that, you know, the elections matter, and the next governor may discontinue the policy, as has happened in Iowa and Virginia and elsewhere.
Shakur, did you want to add something? You look like you wanted to say something.
No, I was just going to add, just talk a little bit about Iowa and what happened there. And I think Chris is right that it's always good when you win. But you know, those wins can be quickly undone by the next governor coming in. So I think that although we can rejoice and be victorious in a lot of these gubernatorial actions that have taken place, it needs to be something more permanent. And I think that that is probably only going to happen through some federal law that mandates it to be done.
Okay. So I think organizing can help with this, right? And pressuring the governors to act. I think should not be overlooked that Governor Reynolds in Iowa, a Republican, by the way, so there was bipartisan support this year for expanding voting rights to justice-involved residents that we should all be emphasizing, because this is a nonpartisan issue. Voting should not be partisan, even though I know that's idealistic and people like raise their eyebrows at me when I say that in this country. But it's, when you look at Iowa, even though it's a cautionary tale, given the history that Shakur just shared, it is important to recognize that a Republican governor did expand voting rights in the midst of uprisings as a response to the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter and racial justice uprisings that followed. Those uprisings in Iowa created pressure that led to the governor's action that didn't just start this summer, but benefited after years and years of advocacy and organizing in that state to try to get the Constitution changed, number one, but in the meantime, pressured the governor to act. So there's a lot. It's a mix of advocacy, from legislation to organizing to litigation, that can help change these laws and expand the franchise. Any other questions, Morgan?
I'll keep going until the end. So one person wants to know, do we know if there's a vast discrimination, racial or gender, and how difficult it is to regain voting rights? Is there data on, if it's easier for some groups to regain voting rights over others?
I did a little research on that in Florida, and found that there were great disparities, not so much at the decision of who got the rights back eventually, but in eligibility, so that you were screened out as ineligible in part because of monetary sanctions early on. So if you owed money, you were ineligible, and you weren't, and so not even in part of the process. So that's where the discrimination was. It's in those rules, and they were biased by race and by class. And so we see. And so it ended up creating an incredibly disparate result in who got their rights back ultimately.
Someone wants to know, can individuals on federal parole vote in states that people on parole are not allowed to vote?
Well, I know that the federal system has dramatically, they say they've abolished parole. I mean, there's still some people on supervised release, but my understanding is that the state law typically pertains, and that you would have greater difficulty in some states than in others voting while in that.
And there's a horrendous case, which goes to one of your earlier comments, Chris, that one of the things to be paying attention to are the prosecutions for voting, for people who are restricted from voting because of a ban. So a notorious case out of my home state in Texas, a young mother, Crystal Mason, was disappeared for 5 years because she was on federal supervised release and thought she could vote in the 2016 election, and did, and then was prosecuted unjustly, unfairly, and has been disappeared for 5 years and had to leave her family behind. And there were similar prosecutions in North Carolina and other states as well. And it's something that we're going to have to be watching and following up on.
The next question is, what would the panelists suggest is the best model for building popular support? How compelling are the voices of formerly incarcerated people in making a difference? And are there video archives of these compelling narratives available?
Can weigh in on this just because we actually did some polling earlier in the year regarding the messaging that we were using. And we found in California that for our campaign, what resonated the most with potential voters was the personal stories of people who had been impacted when they shared, what their experience had been like, and their background and where they are now. That had a huge impact on somebody deciding to support the proposition or not. And so that's actually what we've been really pushing more on our campaign, is the voices of those who have been directly impacted to share their stories, their experience, because that's what we found resonated the most with California voters. And I think that is a large part due to the success that we've had in our polling in terms of support, is just really sharing those stories from folks who are seeking to have re-enfranchisement in California.
Just to kind of follow that. Yep, the personal stories I think are ultimately important to the successful efforts, but personal stories alone are not going to be enough. There needs to be some strategic plan involved with that, so that how those personal stories can be utilized in the most effective way to begin to change people's hearts and minds, to let people know that look, at some point we have all made mistakes in our life. None of us are the worst mistake that we have ever made in our life. We can get past it, we can move beyond it, we can become part of the integrated community again, paying taxes, being responsible, doing all other things that people expect us to do. But that is a community effort.
This kind of feeds into, what you all just said, but people are asking, what about the other barriers to voting, like long lines, inaccessible polling locations, voter intimidation? How do we fold in the need to end felony disenfranchisement laws with some of these other voting access problems that we're having today?
I don't know if Daisy or Don, if you can share out any experiences given the current campaign, or Shakur, given the current campaign work that y'all are doing.
Or if it's important to keep it separate, either way.
Yeah, I guess one of the things is in national voting rights discussion, where it is expanding the vote to people with felony convictions fit into that question, fit into some of these larger discussions.
I think that's something that I think we'll have to still continue to tackle. Like, it doesn't just end with restoring voting rights, because we in California in particular, just because that's where I'm from and that's where I'm more familiar, on election day, we're often seeing on the news, the channels reporting of long lines and people experiencing issues at the polls. So I think that definitely is another area that we need to pursue to be able to make it easier and not discourage folks from going to the polls in California. That's kind of like something that we've been doing in our campaign, is really encouraging folks to vote early, especially in the midst of the pandemic, just to avoid any issues that could happen. But that is definitely a whole separate thing that we need to work on to ensure that people don't get turned away or discouraged from casting their ballot on, for the upcoming elections as we continue to move forward.
Great. Morgan, do you think we should just maybe close out with one more question or so?
Sure. The last question is, how does anyone determine the status of any voter disenfranchisement by state? Where can people go to figure out whether or not, if they have a felony conviction, if they can vote or not?
If they themselves have a felony conviction. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. A lot of times when, over 90% of people plead guilty to a crime, when charged with a crime, and people may not understand exactly what they're pleading guilty to. So I know one of the strategies has been at the conclusion of a sentence, or actually when someone understands what their sentence is, to notify them of what they're giving up by pleading guilty, or as part of their sentence, what the collateral impacts of that conviction may be. I think it's probably state by state. So I don't know if any of our panelists can share what the specific practice may be in your state, how someone might confirm whether or not they have a felony conviction, and how any voting bans might impact them.
So in Nebraska, you have to check. I have a interesting quick story to share. Initially, when I got out, I got my driver's license. I knew I could not check the box about whether or not I could vote. I did not check that box. That box got checked for me. I ended up getting a notification of my polling site during that election cycle. I knew that it was a felony to be registered. So I had to go to the election commission and actually unregister subsequently to get registered again when I became eligible. So I think, some due diligence on the person's part is going to be important no matter what the location is. But I think the government holds some responsibility upon the time of sentencing to let you know what your rights will be when that sentence ends. I think that would help go a long way as well.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we close out?
I was just going to say the election commission as well can be very helpful.
Wonderful. Well, these are, these policies vary from state to state. I do agree with Shakur. It is the government's responsibility to notify people of, first of all, what they've been convicted of, particularly if there's any questions around that, and certainly what their rights are, specifically since there's been so many changes over the last 25 years, as Chris mentioned in his earlier comments as well. So we are going to wrap up this afternoon. We could talk about this, I know, all day, and there's so many questions and comments from people who've joined us, and we are grateful for everyone's time. We'll wrap up. This is not the end of a conversation, though. We want to encourage people to continue to be in contact with the Sentencing Project, as well as all of our panelists. If you have any any follow-up questions or anything else you want to share, we'll send out the link to this webinar, as well as some other resources, not just from the Sentencing Project, but from also our panelists. And, lastly, we're less than a week out from this election season. If you haven't voted, please do so. If you can't vote because you have a felony conviction, we know that this work is inspired by your current experience. We are motivated to expand the franchise for everyone on this call and everyone in the community, and including those in prison whose vote may literally be locked out this election season, because there are so many reasons why the 2020 presidential election is important, including the fact that our democracy will be tested next Tuesday. It will be tested, and we know that to shore up that democracy will be to expand the vote to everyone and guarantee universal suffrage for even folks who've been disappeared for life inside of America's prisons. So, we want to encourage you all to continue to work with us to expand that franchise, to defend and support democracy going into next Tuesday, and to continue to work with us, even though this conversation is ending this afternoon. So thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for your inspiring work and your words, and we'll continue to be continued.